The night Clara Ashford decided to leave her father's house, the Wyoming sky held no stars. Autumn 1883 had come early to Mercer County, stripping the cottonwoods bare and turning the prairie grass to copper wire. The wind carried the smell of coming snow and the sharper scent of her father's whiskey, seeping through the walls of the clapboard house like a warning she'd learned too late to heed. She moved through her bedroom in darkness, hands working by memory. A dress, 2 shifts. The photograph of her mother taken before grief had hollowed her out. The leather satchel her grandfather had made supple and strong, designed to last longer than hope usually did. Clara's fingers trembled as she buckled the straps, not from fear exactly, but from the electric recognition that this moment, this choice would split her life into before and after. From the room below came the sounds that had scored her childhood, her father's voice thick with drink and rage, the crash of pottery meeting floorboards, her mother's silence, which was worse than screaming because it meant she'd learned that screaming changed nothing. Clara had learned the same lesson at 14 when she'd tried to stop his hand, and he'd turned that hand on her instead. The scar on her left cheekbone had faded over the years, but she could still feel it sometimes when the weather changed, a ghost of violence marking her face. She was 22 years old. She had lived in this house for all of those years, except the 8 months she'd spent with her sister Annabelle, in Cheyenne, working as seamstresses in a shop that smelled like lavender and new cloth. Those had been the good months, the months when she'd believed life could be different, softer, full of small pleasures like warm bread and the company of women who laughed without looking over their shoulders first. Then her mother had written, "Come home. Your father needs you." And because duty was bred into her bones deeper than rebellion, Clara had come home. Annabelle had stayed in Cheyenne. That was 5 years ago. Clara hadn't seen her sister since. She tied her boots with steady hands, lifted the satchel, and turned toward the window. She'd practiced this exit a dozen times, knew which boards creaked and which stayed silent. Knew the distance from sill to ground was 8 feet manageable if she hung from her fingers first. Knew the cottonwood tree would hide her from the house if she moved quickly toward the creek. She'd planned this escape for months, collecting pennies, memorizing the stage schedule to Laramie, imagining a life that belonged to her instead of being sold piece by piece to pay her father's debts. But when she reached the window, she stopped. The moon had broken through the clouds, and its cold light fell across the trunk at the foot of her bed, her mother's trunk. The one piece of furniture her father hadn't pawned or gambled away because even he understood that some violations were too far. Inside were her mother's wedding dress yellowed with age, a Bible with family names inscribed in fading ink, letters tied with ribbon that Clara had never read because they felt too private, too sad, and one letter addressed to Clara herself in her mother's shaking hand. Her mother had died 3 months ago. Cancer that had eaten through her, slowly turning her transparent before it finally released her. On her deathbed, she'd pressed the trunk key into Clara's palm and whispered, "Read the letter when you're ready to know the truth." Clara hadn't been ready. She'd buried her mother, endured her father's rage at the funeral costs, and tried to pretend the letter didn't exist. But now, with her hand on the windowsill and freedom just 8 feet below, she found she couldn't leave without knowing. Couldn't step into her new life carrying the weight of unread words. She knelt before the trunk. The key turned with a soft click that sounded too loud in the quiet room. She lifted the lid, moved aside the dress and the Bible, and found the envelope. The paper was thin, the kind her mother had used for everything because it was cheap. Clara broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Her mother's handwriting staggered across the page, getting worse toward the end as pain or weakness had claimed her hand. "My dearest Clara," it began, and something in those 3 words made Clara's throat tighten. Her mother had never been given to endearments. "If you are reading this, I am gone, and perhaps that is mercy. I have lived too long with secrets that should have been spoken aloud. I have let fear silence me when love should have made me brave. Now, before I leave you, I must tell you what I should have told you years ago. Your sister did not stay in Cheyenne by choice. Annabelle was sold just as you will be sold if you do not leave this house. Your father's debts have grown beyond anything we can pay. He has already approached men in town offering you in settlement. It is only a matter of time. 5 years ago, when Annabelle turned 19, he sold her to a farmer for $80, a man named Ethan Cole. She married him to save us from ruin, and I let her go because I was weak and afraid, and because I told myself she would make a life for herself, as women must. But Clara, my darling girl Annabelle, is dead. The words blurred. Clara blinked, read them again. The letters stayed the same. She died 2 months after her marriage. They said it was an accident, a fall from a wagon during a storm. But I received a letter from her the week before she died, and she was afraid. She wrote of a man named Samuel of secrets she couldn't tell, of feeling trapped in a house that should have been her home. She wrote that if anything happened to her, I should find Ethan Cole because he knew the truth. I did nothing. I was too frightened of your father, too broken by my own life to fight for my daughter's memory. But you are not me, Clara. You are stronger. If you want the truth about your sister's death, find Ethan Cole. The farm is 10 miles north of here in the valley past Henderson's Creek. Ask him what happened to Annabelle. Ask him why he kept silent. And, Clara, if you can forgive me for letting her go, forgive me for not being the mother either of you deserved. The letter ended there unsigned, as if her mother had run out of strength or courage before she could commit her name to these terrible words. Clara sat on the floor of her bedroom, the letter trembling in her hands, and felt the room spin around her. Annabelle was dead, had been dead for 5 years, while Clara lived in ignorance, believing her sister had simply chosen a different life. Her father had sold Annabelle like livestock, and their mother had known, had done nothing, had carried that secret to her grave. And Ethan Cole, whoever he was, knew what had really happened. The rage that rose in Clara's chest was clean and sharp, nothing like the dull fear that usually governed her days. She stood, folded the letter carefully, and placed it in her satchel alongside the photograph of her mother. She would leave tonight as planned, but she would not run to Laramie and disappear into anonymous freedom. She would go north to the valley past Henderson's Creek, and she would find the man who had married her sister, the man who might have killed her. The climb down from the window was easier than she'd imagined. The ground met her feet with a soft thud, and then she was moving through the darkness, following the creek north by the sound of its water over stones. Behind her, her father's house faded into shadow. She didn't look back. The walk took her 4 hours, most of it through open country, where the moon showed her the wagon road cutting pale through the grass. She passed no one. At this hour, sensible people were asleep, and the few travelers she might have encountered would have assumed she was a ghost or a woman with business too dark to share. Either way, they would have let her pass. She reached the town of Mercer Center as dawn broke gray and cold over the eastern plains. It was barely a town, just a main street with a general store, a church, a boarding house, and a saloon that probably did more business than all the others combined. Clara had been here twice before, both times with her father when he came to buy supplies and lose money at cards. She'd never liked it. The place had a hungry look, like it was waiting for something to happen that would justify its existence. She stopped at the general store, which was just opening. The proprietor, a man named Sykes, with soft hands and calculating eyes, looked at her with the kind of attention that made her skin crawl. "I need information," Clara said, keeping her voice level. "About a farmer named Ethan Cole." Sykes' expression shifted, interest sharpening into something else. Wariness, maybe, or recognition. "What business you got with Cole? I'm asking where his farm is located, not why I want to know." Sykes studied her for a long moment, taking in her travel-worn dress, the satchel the set of her jaw. Then he jerked his chin toward the north. 10 miles up the valley road. Can't miss it. Only place out there that still has crops growing." He paused, then added, "You related to that girl who married him, the one that died." Clara felt her heart kick hard against her ribs, but she kept her face smooth. "Why do you ask?" "Because you got the same look, same eyes, same way of standing like you're about to run or fight, and haven't decided which." She didn't answer, just turned and walked out of the store. Behind her, she heard Sykes mutter something to himself, but she didn't care what it was. She had the information she needed. Before she left town, she stopped at the church. It was a small building, white clapboard, with a bell tower that leaned slightly as if the weight of all the prayers it had heard had bent it sideways. The door was unlocked, as church doors always were, and inside she found an old man sweeping the aisle. He looked up as she entered, and his face creased into a smile that seemed genuine. "Reverend Daniel Mills," he said, offering his hand. "You're out early, miss. I'm looking for information about a wedding that took place here, about 5 years ago, between Annabelle Ashford and Ethan Cole." The Reverend's smile faded. He set the broom aside and studied her with eyes that had seen too many funerals and not enough joy. "You're her sister," he said quietly. "I can see it in your face." Clara nodded. Reverend Mills sighed, a sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "That was a sad business, sad from start to finish. Your father brought her here one afternoon, and Ethan Cole was waiting. The girl looked like she'd already been buried and just hadn't lain down yet. And Ethan, well, he looked like a man doing something he'd never forgive himself for. But you married them anyway." "I did. Because if I hadn't, someone else would have, and at least I could say the words with some kindness." He paused, then added, "She died 2 months later, fell from a wagon during a storm, broke her neck." The Reverend's voice dropped lower. "Or that's what we were told." Clara's hands clenched. "What do you mean, what you were told?" "I mean, I saw the body before burial. I saw bruises that didn't match a fall. Saw marks on her wrists like she'd been held down. But Ethan Cole swore it was an accident, and there were no witnesses, and in this territory a man's word about his own wife carries more weight than a reverend's suspicions. Did you tell anyone I told the sheriff?" He looked into it for about 10 minutes and decided there wasn't enough evidence to pursue. Ethan Cole wasn't well liked, but he wasn't hated either. And your sister was just another girl who'd been sold to pay a debt. Nobody cared enough to dig deeper. The Reverend's eyes met hers, and she saw genuine regret there. "I'm sorry. I should have fought harder for her." Clara felt the rage build again, colder, this time more focused. "Where is she buried?" "The old cemetery behind the church. 3rd row near the cottonwood tree. There's no stone. Ethan Cole couldn't afford one," he said, "so it's just a wooden marker with her name." Clara thanked him and left the church. She found the grave where he'd set a simple wooden cross with Annabelle Cole carved in rough letters. No dates, no sentiment, just a name that had already been half erased by weather. She knelt in the grass and placed her hand on the earth that covered her sister. "I'm sorry I didn't know," she whispered. "I'm sorry I wasn't here, but I'm here now, Anna. I'm going to find out what happened to you, I promise." The wind moved through the cottonwood tree, and for a moment Clara let herself imagine it was Annabelle's voice telling her to be careful, to run, to save herself. But Clara had stopped running the moment she read her mother's letter. Whatever happened next, she would face it with her eyes open. She left the cemetery and started walking north again. The valley road stretched ahead of her empty, except for the wind and the grass, and the mountains rising purple in the distance. She walked for 3 hours, and as the sun climbed higher, she began to see the farmsteads scattered across the landscape. Most of them looked hard-used, the kind of places where people worked themselves to death and called it a good life because they had no other choice. But one farm stood different from the rest. It sat in a natural depression where a creek ran year-round, and even in late autumn, its fields showed green with winter wheat. The house was modest, weathered gray by sun and wind, but solid. The barn leaned slightly, but someone had braced it with new timber. There were chickens in the yard, and a cow in a pasture that actually had grass. This was Ethan Cole's farm. Clara knew it the way you know things in your bones before your mind catches up. She stopped at the edge of the property and studied it. No smoke from the chimney, though the day was cold enough to warrant a fire. No movement except the chickens and the wind stirring the laundry on the line. White shirts, work pants, all of it mended carefully, the kind of mending that spoke of solitude and patience. Clara walked up the path to the house. Her boots made soft sounds on the packed earth, and somewhere a crow called out harsh and mocking. She climbed the 3 steps to the porch and raised her hand to knock. The door opened before her knuckles touched wood. The man standing in the doorway was tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of winter storms. He wore work clothes that had seen better years, and his hands, which hung loose at his sides, were scarred and calloused from labor. He looked at Clara without surprise, as if women appeared on his doorstep regularly, though she suspected they did not. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Clara took his measure, looking for signs of violence, of guilt, of the kind of cruelty that could kill a young woman, and call it an accident. But all she saw was weariness that went bone deep, and something else. A kind of resignation, as if he'd been waiting for this moment and was almost relieved it had finally come. "Ethan Cole," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded once. "And you're Clara Ashford, Annabelle's sister." The fact that he knew who she was should have surprised her, but it didn't. In a territory this small news traveled like wind across the prairie, and she supposed her resemblance to her dead sister was marked enough that anyone who'd known Annabelle would recognize Clara instantly. "I want to talk to you about my sister," Clara said. "I figured you might." He stepped back from the door. "You'd better come in." The interior of the house was not what she'd expected. She'd imagined squalor, or at least the kind of bachelor chaos that came from a man living alone. But the main room was clean, almost Spartan. A table with 2 chairs, a stove that showed signs of regular use, shelves with a few books, their spines cracked from reading. Everything functional, nothing decorative. It was the home of someone who'd stripped his life down to necessities and couldn't be bothered with anything that didn't serve a purpose. Except for one thing. On the wall above the fireplace hung a photograph in a simple frame. Clara moved closer and felt her breath catch. It was Annabelle. Younger than Clara remembered her, maybe 18, wearing a dress Clara recognized from their mother's trunk. But she wasn't alone in the photograph. A man stood beside her, his arm around her waist, and he was smiling at the camera with the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no. The man was not Ethan Cole. Clara turned to find Ethan watching her, his face unreadable. "That's your sister," he said. "On her wedding day. But not to you. Number. Not to me. To Samuel Thornton." The name meant nothing to Clara, but the way Ethan said it, like swallowing poison, told her everything she needed to know about the man in the photograph. "I don't understand," Clara said slowly. "You married my sister." The Reverend confirmed it. "But this photograph shows her marrying someone else." "Your sister married me." In-law Ethan said, his voice flat and distant, as if he were recounting someone else's story. "But her heart belonged to Samuel. It always did." He moved to the window and stood looking out at his fields. "She never wanted me. Never pretended to. On our wedding night she told me the truth, that she loved another man, that her father had sold her to me, but she would never truly be mine." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. "And you accepted that? What choice did I have? I'd paid the debt. We were married in the eyes of God and the law. I thought maybe over time she might come to care for me, or at least tolerate me. But she didn't. She spent 2 months living in this house like a prisoner, waiting for the man she actually loved to come rescue her." "Did he?" Clara asked, though she was beginning to suspect she knew the answer. Ethan turned from the window, and for the first time she saw real emotion in his face. Pain old and deep that had scarred him as surely as work had scarred his hands. Samuel Thornton came for her, yes. On a night in October during a storm, they planned to run away together. She'd stolen money from me enough to get them to California. She was 3 months pregnant with his child. He paused, and his jaw tightened. She died before they could leave, fell from the wagon when the horse spooked in the storm, broke her neck. Samuel disappeared. I buried your sister alone. Clara's mind raced, trying to fit this new information together with what the Reverend had told her. The bruises, the marks on Annabelle's wrists. You're lying, she said softly. Am I? The Reverend said there were signs of violence, that it didn't look like an accident. Ethan's expression didn't change. The Reverend is a good man who sees evil where sometimes there's only tragedy. Your sister fought with me that night. She didn't want to leave, and when I tried to stop her, she scratched my face, bruised my hands with her nails. But I didn't kill her, Miss Ashford. I loved her, foolish as that was. I would have let her go if that's what she wanted. But the storm, the horse, bad luck, God's judgment, whatever you want to call it, she died before I could make that choice. Clara studied his face, looking for lies. But Ethan Cole looked back at her with the steady gaze of a man who'd already been judged and found guilty by everyone who mattered and had nothing left to lose by telling the truth. Why didn't you tell anyone about Samuel, about the pregnancy? Because I had no proof. Samuel Thornton is the son of the most powerful landowner in the county. His father held my mortgage, my future, everything I'd worked for. If I'd accused Samuel of running away with my wife, of getting her pregnant, I'd have been ruined. And what good would it have done? She was already dead. Revenge wouldn't bring her back. So you just let everyone believe you killed her. I let them believe what they wanted to believe. He sat down at the table, suddenly looking older than his 30 years. I've lived with their suspicions for 5 years. I've watched my neighbors cross the street to avoid me. I've seen mothers pull their daughters close when I walk by. I've earned my isolation honestly, Miss Ashford, not by killing your sister, but by being too weak to fight for her while she lived and too cowardly to clear my name after she died. Clara felt the foundations of her certainty begin to crack. She'd come here expecting a monster and instead found a man who seemed more broken than dangerous. "Why are you telling me all this?" she asked. "Because you deserve to know the truth about your sister. Because I'm tired of carrying this alone. And because," he met her eyes directly, "I suspect you didn't come here just to ask questions. You came here because you're running from the same thing Annabelle was running from, your father." Clara felt her spine stiffen. "You don't know anything about me. I know your father sold Annabelle for $80 to pay a gambling debt. I know he'd do the same to you if you gave him the chance. I know that look in your eyes, the one that says you're deciding whether to run or fight, and you haven't quite settled on which." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Am I wrong?" She wanted to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself sitting down across from him, setting her satchel on the floor with the heaviness of someone laying down a burden they'd carried too long. "He's already made arrangements," she said quietly, "to sell me to a merchant in Laramie. $50 and his slate wiped clean at the saloon. I have maybe a week before he finalizes it. And you're here because you hoped I killed your sister. Hoped I was a monster you could destroy, and in destroying me somehow make sense of what happened to her. Maybe." Clara looked at the photograph on the wall, at her sister's young face frozen in a moment of false happiness. "Or maybe I hoped you'd tell me the truth, even if the truth is uglier than a simple murder. The truth usually is." They sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, bringing with it the smell of distant rain. The light through the windows turned gray and soft, and Clara found herself noticing small details about the room. The way Ethan's books were arranged by size rather than subject, the careful mending on the curtains, the complete absence of anything that spoke of Annabelle, as if he'd erased her from his life, except for that one photograph above the fireplace, kept like a wound he couldn't let heal. "I have a proposal," Clara said finally. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "Marry me." The words hung in the air between them, absurd and practical at the same time. Ethan didn't laugh, which she respected him for. Instead, he leaned forward, his storm-gray eyes searching her face. "Why would I do that?" "Because you need a wife to stop the rumors. Because the law in Wyoming says a married man has stronger claim to his homestead than a single one. Because Samuel Thornton's father just died, and Samuel inherited everything, including your mortgage, and you need stability to fight him if he comes calling." Clara counted the reasons on her fingers. "And because I need a place to hide from my father where he can't touch me. A marriage license is legally binding. Even he wouldn't dare try to sell a woman who's already married." "And what do you get out of this besides sanctuary time?" Clara said. "Time to find out what really happened to Annabelle. Time to investigate without my father dragging me back home. Time to decide what kind of life I want instead of having it decided for me." "You think I killed her," Ethan said, not a question, just a statement of fact. "And yet you're proposing marriage. I think there's more to the story than you've told me. I think Samuel Thornton knows something you're not saying. I think my sister's death was more complicated than an accident or a murder, and I want to know the truth, whatever it costs me. Even if the truth is that I'm a killer, even then, at least I'd know." Ethan stood and walked to the fireplace. He stared up at the photograph of Annabelle and Samuel for a long time, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with something that might have been grief or anger or both. "I've been alone for 5 years, Miss Ashford. Alone in this house where your sister died, alone with everyone's judgment and my own guilt for not being enough to save her. If you marry me, you'll be alone too, in a different way. Because I won't touch you, won't demand anything of you except the appearance of a normal marriage. You'll be safe from your father, but you'll also be trapped here with me and with the ghost of a woman you loved and lost before you even had the chance to save her." "I know," Clara said, "and I accept those terms." "Why?" "Because maybe we can help each other survive what we've both lost. Because I'm tired of being powerless. And because I think you're telling me the truth, Mr. Cole. Maybe not all of it, but enough that I'm willing to take the risk." Ethan turned from the photograph and looked at her. In the gray light, his face was all hard planes and shadows, and Clara thought that if he were a different kind of man, he would be frightening. But there was something in his eyes, a kind of desperate honesty, that made her believe he was exactly what he claimed to be. A man broken by circumstances, trying to survive in the wreckage. "All right," he said finally. "We'll do this, but on one condition. Name it. If you find proof that I killed Annabelle, you turn me in. No hesitation, no mercy. You promise me that if I'm guilty, you'll see justice done." Clara thought about her sister's grave with its wooden cross and anonymous earth, thought about 5 years of silence and suspicion, thought about the photograph on the wall capturing a moment of love that had led to death. "I promise," she said. They rode to town the next morning and married in Reverend Mill's church with the same spare ceremony that had bound Annabelle to Ethan 5 years before. The Reverend asked no questions, though his eyes held concern as he pronounced them man and wife. Clara wore the same dress she'd arrived in. Ethan wore his work clothes. There were no flowers, no celebration, no kiss to seal their vows, just two people making a bargain written in desperation and hope. That night, Clara stood in the bedroom that had been Annabelle's, looking at the narrow bed and the single window that faced north toward the mountains. Ethan had given her the room without comment, then disappeared into the barn where he said he'd sleep. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and opened her satchel. Inside was her mother's letter, the photograph, and the clothes she'd brought. She pulled out the letter and read it again, looking for clues she might have missed. "Find Ethan Cole," her mother had written. "He knows the truth." Clara was beginning to think the truth was a many-sided thing, different depending on which angle you approached it from. Ethan knew one truth. Samuel Thornton probably knew another. And somewhere in the space between those competing narratives lay what had really happened to Annabelle. She stood and went to the window. Outside, a light burned in the barn. She could see Ethan's silhouette moving through the lamplight, settling in for another night alone. He'd kept his promise, already giving her safety and solitude. Now she had to keep hers. Find the truth, no matter what it cost. Clara turned from the window and began her search. She went through every drawer in the room, every trunk, every hidden corner. She found Annabelle's few possessions that had been left behind. A comb with missing teeth. A shawl that still smelled faintly of lavender. A book of poetry with certain passages, underlined verses about longing and forbidden love. But she found no diary, no letters, nothing that would tell her what Annabelle had been thinking in those last 2 months of her life. Frustrated, Clara looked up at the ceiling. The house had an attic. She'd seen the trapdoor in the hallway barely visible in the shadows. If Ethan had kept anything of Annabelle's anything he didn't want found, he'd have hidden it there. She fetched a chair from the kitchen and positioned it beneath the trapdoor. The ladder came down with a creak of old wood, and Clara climbed up into darkness that smelled of dust and mice and secrets. Her eyes adjusted slowly. The attic was small, cramped beneath the sloping roof with barely enough room to stand. But there, in the far corner, she saw what she was looking for. A trunk. Locked, but the lock was old and simple. Clara used a hairpin to work it open. The lock gave way with a soft click, and she lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, was a wedding album. Clara's hands shook as she unwrapped it and opened to the first page. There was the photograph from downstairs, but larger, more detailed. Annabelle in her borrowed dress, radiant with happiness. And beside her, Samuel Thornton, handsome and confident, his hand possessive on her waist. The photograph had been taken in a studio in Cheyenne. The date inscribed at the bottom was 2 months before Annabelle married Ethan. Clara turned the pages. More photographs. Annabelle and Samuel at a restaurant on a riverbank in front of a hotel. The progression of a courtship documented and real. And beneath the album, wrapped in the same oilcloth, a diary. Clara opened it with trembling fingers. The first entry was dated a week after Annabelle's marriage to Ethan. "I am living a lie," Annabelle had written in her neat, careful script. "Married to a man I do not love, carrying the child of the man I do. Samuel promises he will come for me. Promises we will run away together, start fresh in California where no one knows us. I must believe him. I must hold on to that hope, or I will go mad in this empty house with this silent man who looks at me like I am something precious he cannot touch." Clara read through weeks of entries, watching her sister's desperation grow. Annabelle wrote of Ethan's kindness, his patience, the way he gave her space and never demanded what she could not give. But she also wrote of her love for Samuel, her certainty that he would rescue her, her fear of what would happen if Ethan discovered the truth about the pregnancy. Then came the final entry, dated the day of her death. The handwriting was agitated loops too wide, words scratched out and rewritten. "Ethan knows. He found the letters Samuel sent. He knows about the baby. He says he will not stop me from leaving, but I see the betrayal in his eyes. I see how much I have hurt him by using his kindness against him. Samuel is coming tonight. We will take the wagon and leave before dawn. Ethan will not try to stop us, because he is too good, too decent, too broken by what I have done to him. I am afraid, not of Ethan, but of what comes after. Samuel says he loves me, but tonight when we spoke I saw something in his face I have never seen before. Impatience, annoyance, as if I am a problem he must solve rather than a woman he loves. If anything happens to me, if I do not reach California, someone must know the truth. Ethan Cole is innocent. Whatever people say, whatever they believe, he did not hurt me. The hurt I carry is my own making." The entry ended there, the last words of a woman who would be dead before morning. Clara closed the diary and sat in the darkness of the attic trying to process what she had read. Ethan had told her the truth, or at least his version of it, but there were still pieces missing. Samuel's role. What had happened in those final hours? Why Annabelle had sounded afraid of the man she claimed to love. A sound below made Clara freeze. Footsteps on the ladder. She quickly wrapped the diary and album back in oilcloth and closed the trunk, but she was too slow. Ethan's head appeared through the trapdoor. He looked at her at the trunk, and his face showed no surprise, only a weary kind of resignation, as if this moment too had been inevitable. "You found it," he said. "Not a question." "Yes. And now you know." Clara climbed down the ladder, the diary clutched in her hands. She faced Ethan in the hallway, the lamplight casting long shadows between them. "I know Annabelle loved Samuel. I know she was pregnant. I know she planned to leave with him that night." She paused. "But I also know you didn't kill her." She wrote it in her own words. Ethan's shoulders sagged slightly, as if a weight he'd been carrying had shifted. "Thank you for believing that." "But I don't know what happened," Clara continued. "Not really. Because if she died in an accident, why was she afraid? Why did the Reverend see bruises that didn't match a fall? And why did Samuel disappear instead of staying to bury the woman he supposedly loved? Those are questions I've been asking myself for 5 years, Ethan said quietly. Then maybe it's time we found the answers together. Ethan looked at her, and something passed between them in that dim hallway. Not trust exactly, not yet, but the beginning of an alliance. Two people bound by marriage and grief and the need to know what had really happened on a stormy night 5 years ago. "All right," Ethan said finally. "Where do we start?" Clara thought of the photograph, the confident smile on Samuel Thornton's face, the possessive hand on her sister's waist. "We start with Samuel," she said. "We find him, and we make him tell us the truth. And if he won't, then we find someone who will." Clara met Ethan's eyes. "Someone always knows the truth, Mr. Cole. We just have to find them before they find us." Outside, the wind rose higher, bringing with it the first drops of the storm that had been threatening all day. In the attic above them, Annabelle's trunk sat closed and silent, holding its secrets. And in a house 10 miles south, a man named Samuel Thornton sat in his inherited mansion and made plans that would change everything. Clara thought she knew about justice, truth, and the price of asking questions no one wanted answered. But that would come later. For now, Clara Ashford Cole stood in a narrow hallway with a man she'd married to escape one trap only to find herself in another, more complicated one. And she realized that the truth she'd come looking for was not a single thing, but a web of lies and loves and betrayals so tangled that pulling one thread might unravel everything. She tightened her grip on the diary and made a choice. She would pull that thread, she would unravel the web, and she would find out what had really happened to Annabelle, no matter how many secrets she had to expose, how many lives she had to disrupt, how much danger she had to walk into. Because in the end, her sister deserved the truth. And Clara deserved to know whether she'd married a good man caught in terrible circumstances, or whether she'd made the same mistake Annabelle had, trusting someone who would ultimately betray her. The storm broke over the farmhouse with thunder that shook the walls. Clara stood at the window of her bedroom and watched lightning illuminate the valley. Somewhere out there, answers waited. Somewhere out there, Samuel Thornton slept in comfort and safety, believing his secrets were buried with Annabelle. He was wrong. Clara would make sure of that. She turned from the window and lay down on the bed that had been her sister's, pulled the thin blanket up to her chin and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, the investigation would begin in earnest. Tomorrow, she would start asking questions and demanding answers. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of uncovering a truth that had been hidden for 5 years. But tonight, she would rest. She would gather her strength, and she would prepare for the battles ahead, knowing that some truths once uncovered could never be buried again. Knowing that the choice she'd made to come here to marry Ethan, to seek justice for Annabelle, was a choice that would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The rain fell harder. The thunder rolled away toward the east, and in the barn, Ethan Cole lay awake on his bed of hay, staring at the darkness, and wondered what he had unleashed by telling Clara the truth, or at least the parts of the truth he was willing to share, because everyone, even honest men, kept secrets, and some secrets were worth dying to protect. The morning after Clara found Annabelle's diary, she woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of rain still falling on the roof. For a confused moment, she forgot where she was. Then memory returned with the weight of stones. She was married to Ethan Cole. She was sleeping in her dead sister's bed. She was hunting a truth that might destroy everything she thought she understood about love and betrayal. She dressed quickly in the cold room and went downstairs. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, 2 cups of coffee already poured, steam rising in the gray morning light. He looked like he hadn't slept, dark circles under his eyes and his hair uncombed. When he saw her, he stood awkward and formal, as if unsure how to behave around a wife who was also an investigator of his possible crimes. "I read the rest of the diary last night," Clara said, sitting down across from him. "After you went back to the barn," Ethan nodded slowly, and Annabelle believed you were a good man. She felt guilty for using you. But she also wrote that she was afraid of Samuel at the end, that something had changed in him." Clara wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone that she was afraid of him? Because fear isn't proof. Because Samuel's father owned half the county, including my mortgage. Because I was a farmer with dirt under my nails, and Samuel was a gentleman with money in his pockets and lawyers on retainer." Ethan's voice was flat, resigned. Who would they have believed? The question hung between them unanswerable, because they both knew the truth. In Wyoming Territory in 1883, justice followed money more reliably than it followed evidence. "I want to visit her grave again," Clara said, "and I want to talk to the doctor who examined her body, the one who told the Reverend about the bruises." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "You're really going to do this? Investigate like you're some kind of detective? I'm going to find out what happened to my sister." "Yes, even if it leads you back to me. Even if you find something in your investigation that proves I'm lying." Clara met his storm-gray eyes and saw genuine fear there. Not fear of being caught, but fear of losing something he'd only just found. Her belief in him, fragile as it was. "Especially then," she said quietly, "because if you killed her, I need to know. And if you didn't, I need to prove it. Not just for Annabelle, but for you. You've lived under suspicion for 5 years, Mr. Cole. Don't you want to be free of that?" "Freedom isn't always what it's promised to be," Ethan said. But he stood and went to the peg by the door where his coat hung. "I'll hitch the wagon. We'll go to town together." The rain had turned the roads to mud that sucked at the wagon wheels and made the journey to Mercer Center take twice as long as it should have. They rode in silence for the first hour, both lost in their own thoughts. Clara studied the landscape, trying to imagine her sister traveling this same road 5 years ago, newly married to a stranger, pregnant with another man's child, desperate and afraid. What was she like, Clara asked suddenly. Annabelle, when she lived with you. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. Beautiful, sad, like a bird in a cage that was too small. She moved through the house like a ghost, touching things but not really seeing them. She'd stand at the window for hours looking south toward town, waiting for something that never came. Until it did. Did you love her? The question seemed to surprise him. He was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Yes, I know I shouldn't have. I know she didn't want my love, that it was probably a burden to her, but I couldn't help it. She was the first beautiful thing that had ever been mine, even if she wasn't really mine at all." That must have hurt, knowing she loved someone else every single day. But I told myself that maybe if I was patient enough, kind enough, she might learn to care for me. Not love, maybe, but something softer than the cold politeness she showed me. Ethan's jaw tightened. "I was a fool. You were hopeful. That's different." "Is it?" They reached Mercer Center as the rain finally stopped, leaving. The town washed clean and smelling of wet earth. Clara directed Ethan to the doctor's house, a neat white building on the edge of town with a shingle hanging outside that read, "William Hartley, Physician and Surgeon." Dr. Hartley was an old man, at least 60, with white hair and gentle hands that trembled slightly when he opened the door. He looked at Ethan, and something passed across his face. Recognition and wariness and something else. Pity, maybe. "Mr. Cole," the doctor said carefully, "I heard you'd remarried." He looked at Clara, and his eyes widened. "Good Lord, you're her sister." "Clara Ashford. Clara Cole now. I want to talk to you about Annabelle's death." The doctor glanced at Ethan, then back to Clara. "Perhaps you should come in, both of you." The interior of the doctor's house smelled like carbolic acid and old books. He led them to a study lined with medical texts and gestured for them to sit. He remained standing, looking uncomfortable, his hands clasped behind his back. "I told Reverend Mills what I saw," he said without preamble. "Bruises on her wrists, marks around her throat that were faint but visible, injuries that seemed inconsistent with a simple fall from a wagon." "You think she was murdered," Clara said, not asking, stating. "I think the evidence suggested violence beyond what a fall would produce. But I also found injuries consistent with a fall. A broken neck, fractured ribs, severe trauma to the head." Dr. Hartley looked at Ethan. "I told the sheriff all of this. He chose not to pursue it. Because he believed Ethan was guilty and couldn't prove it. Or because he believed Samuel Thornton's father when he said there was nothing to investigate." The doctor's silence was answer enough. Clara leaned forward, the bruises on her wrists. Could they have come from someone grabbing her, trying to stop her from leaving? Possibly. Or from someone restraining her against her will. The marks were several hours old when I examined the body, made before she died, but not immediately before. So someone grabbed her, held her earlier that evening. Then later she fell from the wagon. Or was pushed, the doctor said quietly. Ethan had been silent through this exchange, his face pale and set. Now he spoke, his voice rough. "I grabbed her wrists that night, when she tried to take my horse, the one she couldn't control. I was trying to stop her from getting herself killed on an animal that was too spirited for her. We struggled. She scratched my face. I let her go, and she took the wagon instead with the older horse that was gentler. Those bruises were from me, but I didn't kill her." Dr. Hartley studied him. "I believe you, Mr. Cole. I've always believed you. But belief isn't evidence, and evidence without context is just confusion." "What about the marks on her throat?" Clara asked. "Faint. Could have been from a scarf or a high collar. Could have been from hands. I couldn't say definitively." The doctor moved to his desk and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. "I kept my notes from the examination. Against protocol, perhaps, but I had a feeling they might be needed someday." He handed the notebook to Clara. Everything I observed is written there. Make of it what you will." Clara took the notebook with shaking hands. "Thank you." They left the doctor's house and stood on the muddy street. Clara opened the notebook and read through the physician's careful notes. The clinical language couldn't hide the violence of what had happened to Annabelle. Broken bones, bruised flesh, a young woman's body destroyed in a moment of terror or accident or murder. "We need to find out who else was there that night," Clara said, closing the notebook. "The blacksmith told the Reverend he saw 2 men leaving your farm, you and someone taller. That was Samuel," Ethan said. "He came to collect Annabelle. I saw him arrive, saw them loading her things into his wagon. I didn't stop them. I just watched from the barn, too much of a coward to fight for something that was never really mine." "But if you were in the barn and Samuel and Annabelle were leaving together, then why did the blacksmith see 2 men? Why not a man and a woman?" Ethan's face went blank. "I don't know." "Or you're lying," Clara said softly. "You were there. You followed them." "I followed them, yes." Ethan's voice was tight with emotion. "I followed them because I was drunk and angry and heartbroken, and I wanted to see the man she'd chosen over me. I wanted to understand what Samuel Thornton had that I didn't. I caught up with them about 2 miles down the road at the bend where the creek crosses. They'd stopped the wagon. They were arguing. About what I couldn't hear, I stayed back in the trees. But I saw Annabelle crying, saw Samuel grab her arm roughly, saw her try to pull away. Then the storm hit in earnest lightning and thunder, and the horses spooked. Annabelle's wagon lurched forward. She was thrown out. I heard her scream, heard the terrible sound of her body hitting the ground. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. By the time I got there, she was dead, neck broken. And Samuel was gone. He ran. He just left her. He ran. I never saw him again. Not at the funeral, not anywhere. He disappeared like smoke, and his father spread the story that Samuel was traveling back east on business. Everyone believed it because they wanted to believe it, because questioning a Thornton was harder than blaming a poor farmer. Clara felt her chest tighten with rage. So Samuel killed her. Maybe not intentionally, but he grabbed her, frightened her, caused the horses to spook. He killed her, and then ran away and let you take the blame. "That's what I've believed for 5 years, Ethan said, "but I have no proof, just my word against the memory of a dead man's son." "Samuel's not dead. His father is. Samuel inherited everything 3 months ago. He's back in the county now, running the empire his father built. And if he knows I'm the only witness to what really happened that night, he might decide to do something about it." They returned to the farm in heavy silence. Clara spent the afternoon going through Annabelle's diary again, looking for any mention of friends, confidants, anyone who might have known about the relationship with Samuel. She found one name repeated several times: Margaret Fletcher. "Who is Margaret Fletcher?" Clara asked Ethan over dinner. He looked up from his plate, surprise crossing his face. "How do you know that name? Annabelle wrote about her in the diary. Said Margaret was her only friend in Mercer Center, that they'd known each other in Cheyenne before Annabelle married you." Ethan set down his fork. Margaret Fletcher was Annabelle's closest friend, maybe her only real friend. She was married to a wealthy merchant, James Fletcher, who died about a year after Annabelle did. She lives alone now in the big house on the hill outside town. I've seen her at church sometimes, but we've never spoken. "I need to talk to her," Clara said. "Tomorrow." The next day dawned clear and cold, the first true autumn day after weeks of uncertain weather. Clara borrowed one of Ethan's horses and rode alone to Margaret Fletcher's house. It sat on a rise overlooking the valley, a 2-story Victorian painted white with green shutters and a widow's walk on the roof. The kind of house that spoke of old money and older grief. A servant answered Clara's knock, an elderly woman with suspicious eyes, who looked Clara up and down before asking her business. "I'm Clara Cole. I need to speak with Mrs. Fletcher about my sister Annabelle." The servant's expression shifted. "Wait here." She returned 5 minutes later and led Clara through a house that was beautiful and lifeless, all expensive furniture and closed curtains, and the smell of rooms that were never used. Margaret Fletcher waited in the parlor, sitting by a window that looked out over the valley. She was perhaps 28, with auburn hair and dark eyes that held the kind of sadness that went bone deep. She wore black, still in mourning for her husband, though he'd been dead for 4 years. When she saw Clara, she stood so quickly that her teacup rattled on its saucer. "You're Annabelle's sister," she said, and her voice broke on the name. Clara nodded. "Clara, I'm trying to find out what happened to her. I was hoping you could help me." Margaret's face crumpled. She sat down again heavily, as if her legs wouldn't hold her. "I've been waiting for someone to ask me that question for 5 years, hoping and dreading it in equal measure." Clara sat across from her. "Tell me what you know." Margaret looked at her hands, which were twisting a handkerchief into knots. "Annabelle and I met in Cheyenne. We worked in the same dress shop. We became friends because we were both trapped in lives we didn't choose, both waiting for something better that never seemed to come. When she had to leave to marry Ethan Cole, I thought I'd never see her again. But then my husband brought me to Mercer Center, and there she was, married to a man she didn't love, carrying another man's child, desperate and alone. You knew about Samuel. Everyone knew about Samuel if they were paying attention. He was beautiful and charming and completely heartless." She paused, and something raw crossed her face. "I loved him too." The words fell like stones into still water. Clara stared at Margaret, understanding dawning. "You and Annabelle," she said slowly. "You were both in love with the same man." Margaret nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "We didn't know at first. Samuel kept us separate, careful. He courted Annabelle in secret while he was courting me publicly. My husband was old and sick, and Samuel knew he'd inherit money when my husband died. He wanted that money. But he also wanted Annabelle because she was beautiful and young and didn't demand anything from him except love. So what happened?" Margaret stood and walked to the window, her back to Clara. "What happened is that I found out. I followed Samuel one night and saw him with Annabelle, saw the way he looked at her, the way he touched her, the way he'd never looked at me or touched me. And I realized I'd been a fool, that to Samuel we were both just things to use. I was money, she was pleasure. Neither of us was real to him. Did you confront him? I did. 3 days before Annabelle died, I told him I knew about her, about the baby. I threatened to tell my husband to tell Ethan to expose him for the liar he was." Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "He laughed at me, said I wouldn't tell anyone because I was too weak, too desperate for his affection, and he was right. I hated myself for it, but he was right. What happened the night Annabelle died, Margaret turned from the window, and her face was ravaged with guilt. I was there." The confession hung in the air between them. Clara felt her heart begin to pound. "You were there," she repeated. "You saw what happened. I saw everything." Margaret sank back into her chair as if the weight of the secret had been holding her upright, and now that it was spoken she had no strength left. "Samuel sent me a note that afternoon, said he needed to see me, that he was leaving Mercer Center and wanted to say goodbye. I went to the meeting place, the bend in the road where the creek crosses, but when I arrived, Annabelle was there too. Samuel had told her the same thing. He set you both up. He wanted us to see each other, wanted to watch us fight over him. It was a game to him even then. Even when he was planning to run away, he couldn't resist the cruelty of making us both beg. What happened? We fought. Not physically, but with words that cut worse than knives. Annabelle told me she was pregnant, that Samuel loved her, that they were going to California together. I told her she was a fool, that Samuel didn't love anyone, that he'd abandon her the moment she became inconvenient." Margaret's hands shook, and Samuel stood there watching, smiling, like it was the most entertaining thing he'd ever seen. Then the storm came, thunder and lightning like the end of the world. The horses panicked. Annabelle tried to calm them, but she was crying, not paying attention. Samuel grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the wagon. She jerked free, stumbled, and then Margaret stopped, her face going white. "Then what?" Clara demanded. Then Samuel pushed her. The words were barely a whisper, but they might as well have been shouted. Clara felt the room spin around her. He pushed her. Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength now that the worst was spoken. Not hard, just a shove to make her stop fighting him, but she fell wrong, hit her head on the wagon wheel. The horses bolted. The wheel ran over her neck. There was this terrible sound like wood breaking, and then she was still. And Samuel stared at her body for maybe 10 seconds. Then he looked at me and said, "You saw nothing. If you tell anyone, I'll make sure everyone knows you were here, that you pushed her yourself." out of jealousy. No one will believe a jealous woman over a grieving man. Margaret wiped her tears with trembling fingers. Then he got on his horse and rode away. Left me standing there in the rain with Annabel's body. Why didn't you tell anyone? Clara's voice shook with fury. Why did you let everyone think Ethan did it? Because I was afraid. Because Samuel's father was powerful and ruthless. Because I was a coward. Margaret looked at Clara with eyes full of anguish. I am the reason Ethan Cole has lived under suspicion for 5 years. I am the reason your sister's death was never properly investigated. I am the reason Samuel Thornton walks free, and I have to live with that every single day. They sat in silence for a long moment. Outside clouds were gathering again, promising another storm. Clara thought about her sister dying in the mud, while a man who claimed to love her rode away, and a woman who might have saved her stayed silent. Why are you telling me now? Clara asked finally. Because you came asking. Because I'm tired of living with this secret. Because Margaret met her eyes, and Clara saw genuine remorse there. Maybe I can help you get justice for Annabel, even if it's 5 years too late. I need you to testify, to tell the law what you told me. Margaret laughed a bitter sound. The law won't listen. Samuel is one of the wealthiest men in the territory now. He owns the sheriff, the judge, half the town council. My testimony would be dismissed as the ravings of a jealous woman. Then what good are you? Clara stood, anger making her movements sharp. You let my sister die. You let Ethan suffer, and now you sit in this beautiful house feeling sorry for yourself while Samuel Thornton lives unpunished. Margaret stood too, her face flushed. You think I don't know that? You think I haven't thought about it every day for 5 years? I loved Annabel too, Miss Cole. I loved her, and I failed her, and I have to live with that failure forever. Then help me make it right. How, I don't know yet. But there has to be a way. There has to be something we can do to expose him, to make him pay for what he did. Margaret walked to a secretary desk in the corner and pulled out a wooden box. Inside were letters, dozens of them tied with ribbon. Letters from Samuel to Annabel. I kept them after she died. Stole them from her room before anyone else could find them. They're evidence of the affair, of his promises to run away with her. But they don't prove he killed her. They prove motive, Clara said, taking the box. They prove he had reason to want her gone if she became inconvenient. But we still need a witness. And the only witnesses were Samuel, Annabel, and me. And I've already told you, no one will believe me. Then we make Samuel confess, Clara said. The two women looked at each other, and in that moment something passed between them. Not friendship exactly, but recognition. Two women damaged by the same man, both carrying guilt and grief, both desperate for a chance at redemption. How do we do that? Margaret asked. Clara thought of Ethan waiting at home, of the farm that Samuel's father had once owned the mortgage to, of the power dynamics that governed this territory where money spoke louder than truth. We give him what he wants, she said slowly. We make him think he's won, and then we trap him into telling the truth. The idea formed as she spoke it, dangerous and desperate, and possibly their only chance. She spent the rest of the afternoon with Margaret, going through the letters, planning. When she finally left, the sun was setting, and she rode home through gathering darkness with her mind racing. Ethan was waiting on the porch when she arrived. He helped her down from the horse, his hands careful on her waist, and she saw the question in his eyes. Margaret was there that night, Clara said without preamble. She saw Samuel push Annabel, saw her die, and she's been silent for 5 years because she was afraid. Ethan's face went white. She saw it. She knows the truth. Yes. But she's right that no one will believe her testimony against Samuel. We need another way. She told him about the letters, about the plan forming in her mind. As she spoke, she saw his expression change from hope to fear to something harder. You can't, he said when she finished. You can't put yourself in danger like that. It's not your choice to make. You're my wife. Of course it's my choice. Clara felt anger flare in her chest. I'm your wife in name only, Mr. Cole. You don't get to tell me what risks I can take. They stared at each other in the fading light, and Clara saw Ethan struggling with something. Fear, protectiveness, maybe something deeper that neither of them was ready to name. I can't lose you too, he said finally, his voice rough. I can't watch another woman I care about be destroyed by Samuel Thornton. The admission hung between them. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a warming that was dangerous and unwanted and undeniable. "You barely know me," she said, but her voice had lost its edge. "I know you're brave and stubborn and willing to fight for someone you loved, even though she's gone. I know you're nothing like Annabelle, but you remind me of what I should have fought for when I had the chance." Ethan reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, the gesture so tender that Clara felt her breath catch. "I know I don't want to bury another woman in that cemetery." "Then help me," Clara said. "Help me make sure Samuel Thornton pays for what he did." Before Ethan could answer, they heard the sound of a horse approaching. Both turned to see a rider coming up the path moving fast. As the figure drew closer, Clara recognized the expensive riding clothes, the confident posture. Samuel Thornton had come to them. He dismounted with easy grace, a man completely at home in his own skin. In the lamplight from the house, Clara could see why Annabelle had loved him. He was handsome in a way that seemed almost unfair, with golden hair and blue eyes, and the kind of smile that made you want to believe whatever lies he told. "Mr. Cole Samuel," said his voice smooth as honey. "I heard you'd remarried. How quickly we move on from tragedy." "What do you want?" Samuel Ethan's voice was flat, controlled. Samuel's gaze moved to Clara, and she saw interest kindle in his eyes. "Well, well. Annabelle's little sister. I'd heard rumors, but I didn't believe them. You actually married the man who killed your sister. That's either very forgiving or very foolish." "Ethan didn't kill Annabelle," Clara said. "You did." Samuel's smile didn't waver. Bold accusation from a woman who wasn't there. "Do you have proof? I have witnesses. I have letters. I have enough to make your life very difficult." "Do you?" Samuel's smile widened. "Because I have something better. I have a witness who will testify that Ethan Cole murdered Annabelle in cold blood. An elderly woman who worked in his house, who heard fighting, who heard Annabelle scream for help before everything went silent." "You're lying," Ethan said. "Am I?" Samuel pulled a folded paper from his coat. "This is a sworn statement from Martha Yates. She's prepared to testify in court that she saw you strike Annabelle, saw you follow her out into the storm, saw you return alone with blood on your hands." He held out the paper. "Of course, I could be persuaded not to bring this to the sheriff." "For the right price. Name it," Ethan said through clenched teeth. "Your farm. Sign over the deed and I'll make Mrs. Yates disappear. Refuse and I'll have you arrested for murder by the end of the week." Clara felt her mind racing. This was the trap Samuel had been setting all along. Push Ethan into a corner, force him to give up everything to avoid prosecution. It was elegant and cruel, and exactly what she'd expected from a man who'd killed her sister and walked away. And she realized this was the moment, the chance she'd been waiting for, the opportunity to turn Samuel's confidence against him. "I have a counteroffer," Clara heard herself say. Both men turned to look at her. Samuel's eyebrows rose with interest. Ethan's face showed confusion and dawning horror, as if he could sense what was coming. "I'll marry you," Clara said to Samuel. The words fell into stunned silence. Samuel's smile froze. Ethan took a step toward her, his face going pale. "Clara, what are you doing?" "Getting justice for my sister." She kept her eyes on Samuel. "That's what you want, isn't it? To finish what you started with Annabelle. You loved her once, or told her you did. Now you can have her sister. Younger, unmarried in any way that matters, since this marriage to Ethan was clearly a mistake. I'll marry you publicly, properly. I'll be the wife you wanted Annabelle to be. And in exchange," Samuel's voice was careful now, calculating, "in exchange you tell me the truth about what happened the night she died. Not in court, not officially, just between us. I want to hear it from your own mouth. What really happened, why she had to die." Samuel studied her for a long moment. Clara could see him turning over the offer in his mind, looking for the trap. But his ego was too large, his confidence too deep. He thought he could control this situation, control her, just as he'd controlled Annabelle and Margaret. "Very well," he said finally. "I'll tell you what happened, and you'll marry me. A fair exchange, I think." "There's one more condition," Clara said. "You drop all charges against Ethan. You admit publicly that he had nothing to do with Annabelle's death. That's part of the deal." "Agreed." Samuel's smile returned predatory now. "We'll have dinner tomorrow night. At my house. I'll tell you everything you want to know, and then we'll make arrangements for the wedding." He remounted his horse and rode away into the darkness, leaving Clara and Ethan standing in the yard. As soon as he was out of sight, Ethan grabbed Clara's arm, spinning her to face him. "Have you lost your mind? You can't marry him. You can't put yourself in that position. It's the only way to get him to confess, the only way to clear your name and get justice for Annabelle. By sacrificing yourself, by becoming his wife." "I won't actually marry him," Clara said, though even as she spoke the words she wondered if she believed them. "I just need him to think I will. Need him to feel safe enough to tell me the truth. Once I have his confession, I'll find a way to use it against him." Ethan's hands tightened on her arms. "And if you can't, if he outsmarts you, if he forces you into a marriage you can't escape, then I'll deal with that when it happens. Clara." His voice broke on her name. "Please, there has to be another way." "There isn't." "You know there isn't." She pulled free of his grip. "This is my choice, Ethan, my sister, my investigation. You don't get to stop me, even if it destroys you." Even then. They stood facing each other in the darkness, and Clara saw the war in Ethan's eyes. The desire to protect her, fighting against the knowledge that she was right, that this might be their only chance. Finally his shoulders sagged in defeat. "I can't stop you," he said quietly, "but I can't watch you do this either. If you go to him tomorrow night, you go alone?" "I was always going alone." Clara turned and walked into the house, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She'd just promised to marry the man who killed her sister. She'd just put herself directly in the path of a predator who'd already destroyed one woman and would have no compunction about destroying another. But she'd also just gotten what she needed, the chance to hear the truth from Samuel's own lips, the chance to expose him, to ruin him, to make him pay for what he'd done. And if the cost was her own safety, her own future, maybe even her own life, then that was a price she was willing to pay. She climbed the stairs to her bedroom and stood at the window, looking out at the dark valley. Somewhere out there, Samuel Thornton was riding home, believing he'd won, believing he'd trapped her the same way he'd trapped Annabelle. He was wrong. Clara would go to dinner tomorrow night. She would listen to his confession. She would play the role of willing bride, of foolish girl, blinded by charm and wealth. And then, when the moment was right, she would destroy him. For Annabelle, for Ethan, for every woman who'd ever been used and discarded by men like Samuel Thornton. She pulled out the letters Margaret had given her and read through them again, looking for ammunition. Samuel's promises to Annabelle, his declarations of love, his assurances that he would leave his life behind for her, all lies written in beautiful script on expensive paper weapons he'd used to manipulate a young woman into believing she was cherished. Clara would use those same weapons against him. Outside she heard Ethan moving in the barn, settling in for another night alone. Part of her wanted to go to him to tell him she wasn't as brave as she pretended, that she was terrified of what she'd just set in motion. But she stayed in her room, hardening herself against doubt and fear. Tomorrow she would walk into the lion's den. Tomorrow she would sit across from her sister's killer and smile while he confessed. Tomorrow she would begin the most dangerous performance of her life. And she would not fail, because failure meant more than her own destruction. It meant Samuel would continue to hurt people, would continue to use his wealth and charm as weapons, would continue to believe that he was untouchable. Clara lay down on the bed and closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind raced with possibilities, with plans and contingencies, and the terrible knowledge that she was about to step off a cliff with no certainty of what waited at the bottom. But she'd made her choice. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the Wyoming Valley, Clara Ashford Cole would prepare to become Clara Thornton. Or die trying. The night before Clara was to dine with Samuel Thornton, she could not sleep. She lay in the narrow bed that had been Annabelle's and watched shadows move across the ceiling, cast by moonlight through the bare branches outside. The house was silent except for the wind and the occasional creak of old wood settling, and in that silence Clara felt the weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her like a physical thing. She rose, finally wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and went downstairs. The kitchen was dark and cold. She lit a lamp and sat at the table, her hands wrapped around nothing, because she couldn't bear the thought of coffee or tea or anything that required her to pretend she was fine. The door opened. She looked up to find Ethan standing in the doorway, still dressed despite the late hour. He looked like he hadn't slept either, his face drawn and his eyes shadowed. Neither of them spoke. There seemed to be nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in anger or fear or desperate hope. Instead, Ethan crossed the room and sat down across from her, and they simply looked at each other in the lamplight. Minutes passed. The silence stretched and deepened, becoming something almost sacred. Clara found herself memorizing his face, the line of his jaw, the gray of his eyes that reminded her of winter storms, the way his hands rested on the table, scarred and strong and capable of gentleness she was only beginning to understand. "If I were really going to marry him," Clara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "if that's what it took to expose him, would you still think I was doing the right thing?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said. "I'd think you were being brave and stupid and far too willing to sacrifice yourself for a dead woman's memory. But I'd also understand it, because I've been sacrificing myself for the same reason for 5 years. That's different. You were innocent." "Was I? I let Annabelle go that night. I watched her leave with a man I knew was wrong for her, and I did nothing because I was too hurt and too proud and too convinced that letting her go was the noble thing to do. If I'd stopped her, if I'd fought for her, even though she didn't want me to, she might still be alive. Or she might have died anyway, and you'd be the one who killed her. Maybe. But at least I would have tried." Clara reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid and real. They sat like that for a long time, holding on to each other in the darkness. Two people who'd married for all the wrong reasons, learning that sometimes wrong reasons could lead to something right. "I'm afraid," Clara admitted. The words came out small and young. The voice of the girl she'd been before her mother died, before she learned that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. "I know. What if he hurts me the way he hurt Annabelle?" "Then I'll kill him." Ethan's voice was flat and certain, without drama or bravado. Just a simple statement of fact. "And I'll hang for it without regret." Clara looked at their joined hands and felt something crack open in her chest. "When did this happen?" she asked. "When did we stop being strangers pretending to be married?" "I think it happened the moment you told me you'd marry him to save me. Because that's when I realized you were willing to fight for me the way I should have fought for Annabelle. That's when I knew I'd fallen in love with you." The confession hung in the air between them. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, hot and unexpected. "You can't love me," she said. "You barely know me. I know you're brave when you should be terrified. I know you care more about justice than safety. I know you read poetry at night when you think I can't hear you through the walls. I know you sing to the chickens when you collect eggs. I know you cry in your sleep sometimes, and it breaks my heart that I can't ask you why." Ethan's grip on her hand tightened. "I know enough, Clara. And if you go to Samuel tomorrow and don't come back, I'll spend the rest of my life wishing I'd told you this sooner." Clara stood still, holding his hand, and pulled him to his feet. They stood in the quiet kitchen, with the lamp burning low between them, and she realized that this was the moment, the choice point. She could pull away, could keep the careful distance they'd maintained, could pretend his words hadn't shattered something fundamental in her understanding of what they were to each other. Or she could choose him, really choose him. Not because she was trapped or desperate or had no other options, but because she wanted to. She kissed him. It was nothing like the desperate kiss in the hallway when they'd been fighting. This was slow and deliberate, and full of all the things they hadn't said to each other in the weeks they'd been married. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "Don't go tomorrow," he whispered. "Please, we'll find another way. There is no other way. You know that. Then let me come with you. Let me be there. He'll never confess if you're in the room. It has to be me, alone." Ethan pulled back just far enough to look at her. "Then promise me you'll come back. Promise me this isn't goodbye." "I promise," Clara said, and prayed it wasn't a lie. They went upstairs together, and for the first time since their wedding, they shared a bed. Not for warmth or necessity, but because neither of them could bear to be alone. They lay wrapped around each other in the darkness, and Clara listened to Ethan's heartbeat slow into sleep, while her own mind raced with plans and fears and the terrible knowledge that she might not survive what was coming. But she would try. For Annabelle, for Ethan, for herself. And that would have to be enough. Morning came too soon. Clara dressed in the best clothes she owned, a dark green dress that had been her mother's, and pinned her hair up with the careful attention of someone preparing for battle. When she came downstairs, Ethan was waiting with the wagon hitched and ready. They drove to Samuel's house in silence. The Thornton mansion sat on a hill overlooking Mercer Center, a sprawling testament to wealth built on other people's desperation. 3 stories of white-painted wood and tall windows that caught the morning sun and threw it back like challenges. Ethan stopped the wagon at the end of the long drive. "I'll wait here," he said. "If you're not out in 2 hours, I'm coming in." Clara nodded and climbed down. She walked up the drive alone, her heart pounding, but her steps steady. A servant answered her knock and led her through rooms that were expensively furnished and utterly cold, the kind of spaces designed to impress rather than comfort. Samuel waited in the dining room, standing by a window that overlooked his land. He turned as Clara entered, and his smile was warm and false in equal measure. "Miss Ashford, how lovely you look." He gestured to a chair. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." The table was set for 2 with china and silver that probably cost more than Ethan's entire farm. Clara sat her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. "You promised me the truth," she said without preamble. "About Annabelle. Straight to business. I like that." Samuel poured wine into crystal glasses, the dark red liquid catching the light. "Very well. The truth. Your sister was a beautiful, foolish girl who thought love was enough to overcome reality. I enjoyed her company, enjoyed the challenge of winning her from that dull farmer she married. But when she told me she was pregnant and expected me to abandon everything for her, well." He sipped his wine. "That's when she became inconvenient. So you killed her." "I didn't plan to. The storm, the horses. It was all very chaotic. I simply gave her a small push. When she wouldn't stop crying, wouldn't stop demanding things I couldn't give her, she fell poorly. The wagon wheel did the rest." Samuel's tone was conversational, as if discussing the weather. "A tragedy, really. She could have lived quite comfortably as my mistress if she'd just been reasonable." Clara felt rage build in her chest, hot and clean. "And you felt no guilt? No remorse? Guilt is for people who make mistakes. I made a decision. There's a difference. You're a monster. I'm a realist. Your sister wanted a fairy tale. I gave her reality." Samuel leaned back in his chair. "And now, Miss Ashford, you understand what happened. So let's discuss our arrangement. The wedding can take place next month. I've already spoken to Reverend Mills." Before Clara could respond, there was a commotion in the hall. Raised voices, the sound of someone arguing with the servants. The dining room door burst open, and Margaret Fletcher stood in the doorway. She looked different from the broken woman Clara had met days before. Her face was set with determination, her eyes bright with something that might have been fear or courage or both. Behind her, Clara could see servants trying to restrain her, but Margaret pushed forward into the room. "I heard you were here," she said to Clara. "Heard what he was planning, and I couldn't let it happen again. Couldn't let another woman be destroyed by Samuel Thornton's lies." Samuel's expression shifted from surprise to cold fury. "Margaret, how nice of you to join us. Though I don't recall extending an invitation. I don't need your permission to tell the truth." Margaret moved to stand beside Clara's chair. "Samuel Thornton killed Annabelle Ashford 5 years ago. I saw him do it. I watched him push her, watched her fall, watched him ride away and leave her dying in the mud, and I've been silent about it for too long." Samuel stood slowly, his face darkening. "That's a serious accusation from a woman with a reputation for instability. A woman who's been in mourning for 4 years, who rarely leaves her house, who everyone knows has never recovered from her husband's death. Who do you think they'll believe, Margaret? You or me? They'll believe the evidence." Margaret pulled papers from her reticule and placed them on the table. Letters from Samuel to Annabelle promising her the world. Letters that prove their affair, that prove motive. "And they'll believe Clara Cole, who came here seeking the truth and got Samuel to confess to murder just moments ago." Clara's breath caught. She looked at Margaret in confusion. "But how could you know what he said?" "You just arrived. I've been here since dawn. Margaret said, a small smile crossing her face. "Hiding in the room next door. The servants are loyal to money. Miss Ashford and I paid them well to let me in and to leave that door slightly ajar." She gestured to a door that Clara hadn't noticed concealed behind heavy drapes. "I heard every word Samuel said, every confession, every casual admission of murder." Samuel's face went white, then red with rage. "You're both lying. This is entrapment. No one will believe this conspiracy." The door from the hall opened again, and this time Reverend Mills entered, followed by Dr. Hartley and 3 other men Clara recognized from town. The town council members who served as informal law enforcement in Mercer Center. "We'll believe it," Reverend Mills said quietly, "because we've all suspected the truth for 5 years, but couldn't prove it. Now we can." Samuel looked around the room at the faces watching him, and Clara saw the moment he realized he'd lost. His charm vanished, replaced by something ugly and desperate. "My father built this town," he said. "My money keeps half of you in business. You can't do this to me." "Your father is dead," Dr. Hartley said, "and his debts died with him. We don't owe you anything anymore, Mr. Thornton. I'll fight this. I'll hire lawyers. I'll destroy all of you." "You're welcome to try," Reverend Mills said. "But I suspect when word spreads about what you did when the whole territory knows you murdered a young woman and let an innocent man suffer for it, your money won't buy you much except isolation." Clara stood, her legs shaking but her voice steady. "And I have one more piece of evidence you don't know about Samuel." She pulled out her mother's letter, the one she'd kept close since the night she fled her father's house. "My mother wrote this before she died. She told me that Annabelle sent her a letter a week before she died, saying she was afraid, saying that if anything happened to her, I should find Ethan Cole because he knew the truth." She paused, meeting Samuel's eyes, but my mother did more than that. She kept Annabelle's letter. "The original one where my sister wrote that she feared you, Samuel, that you'd changed, become cruel, that she thought you might hurt her if she didn't do exactly what you wanted. That's convenient. A letter that miraculously appears after 5 years. It's been in my possession since my mother's death 3 months ago, and it's dated and postmarked impossible to forge." Clara handed it to Reverend Mills. "My sister knew she was in danger. She tried to tell someone, and everyone failed her. But we're not failing her anymore." The town council members conferred quietly among themselves. Finally, the eldest, a man named Thomas Brennan, who'd been in Mercer Center since it was founded, spoke. "Samuel Thornton, you're not going to be arrested today. We don't have the authority for that, and the nearest territorial marshal is 3 days away. But we are voting here and now to strip you of your seat on this council, to recommend that all businesses in Mercer Center cease doing trade with you, and to send a full report of these proceedings to the territorial governor." He paused. "You've built your empire on fear and manipulation, Mr. Thornton. As of today, that empire is finished." Samuel looked around the room one last time, seeing only condemnation in every face. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. They heard his footsteps echoing through the empty mansion, heard a door slam, heard the sound of a horse being ridden hard down the drive. "He won't come back," Dr. Hartley said quietly. "Men like him, when they're exposed, they run. He'll leave the territory, probably head east, where no one knows his name. Start over somewhere else." "And the farm?" Clara asked. "Ethan's farm." "Samuel holds the mortgage. Samuel's father's estate is in probate," Brennan said. "The court will appoint an administrator. I'll make sure that administrator knows about Ethan Cole's circumstances, about how the loan was used as leverage. With Samuel gone and his reputation destroyed, I suspect that mortgage will be forgiven as part of settling the estate's debts." Clara felt her knees go weak. It was over. Samuel was finished. Ethan was free, and Annabelle's death would finally be acknowledged for what it was. Murder, not accident. Betrayal, not tragedy. Margaret touched her arm gently. "Are you all right?" Clara looked at this woman who'd been silent for 5 years, carrying guilt that had nearly destroyed her, who'd finally found the courage to speak, to bear witness, to help bring justice, even when it cost her everything. "I'm all right," Clara said. "Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth. I should have told it 5 years ago." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I failed Annabelle, but maybe I didn't fail you." "You saved me," Clara said simply. "If you hadn't been listening, if you hadn't come in when you did, I would have been trapped." They walked out of the mansion together, leaving the men to handle the formal proceedings. Outside, Ethan was pacing beside the wagon, his face tight with worry. When he saw Clara, he ran to her, pulling her into his arms with a force that spoke of hours of terror barely contained. "I'm all right," Clara said against his chest. "It's over," he confessed. "Margaret heard everything. The town council was there. Samuel's finished." Ethan pulled back just far enough to look at her face. "You're sure you're really all right?" "I'm sure." She smiled and felt the truth of it. For the first time since she'd read her mother's letter, since she'd learned about Annabelle's death, she felt like she could breathe. The weeks that followed were strange and unsettled. Samuel Thornton disappeared from Mercer Center, and rumors said he'd fled to Boston or New York or even Europe. His mansion sat empty on the hill, slowly falling into disrepair. The town council officially cleared Ethan of any suspicion in Annabelle's death, and people who'd crossed the street to avoid him for 5 years suddenly remembered they'd always thought him innocent. But Clara found she couldn't settle into the life she'd thought she wanted. Something had shifted in her during those weeks of investigation, those hours of fear and determination. She'd discovered she was stronger than she'd known, braver than she'd believed. And she'd also discovered that marrying Ethan had been the right choice for all the wrong reasons, and now she needed to make it the right choice for the right reasons. 6 months after Samuel's flight, Clara asked Ethan for a divorce. They sat at the kitchen table, where they'd shared so many meals, so many conversations, so many silences. Ethan's face went pale when she spoke the words. "You want to leave?" he said flatly. "Now that you've got justice for Annabelle, now that I'm cleared, you want to go." "No," Clara said. "I want us to start over, really start over, not as two desperate people trapped by circumstances, but as two people who choose each other freely. I want to marry you again, Ethan. But first, I need to not be married to you. I need to know that when I say yes, it's because I want to, not because I have to." Ethan stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly he began to smile. "You're the strangest woman I've ever known. Is that a yes?" "It's a yes." The divorce was quietly processed through the territorial court. Clara moved in with Margaret Fletcher, who'd become a true friend in the month since Samuel's exposure. The two women lived together in Margaret's big house, two widows of a sort, healing from different kinds of grief. And every evening Ethan came to visit. He brought flowers from the fields, books he thought Clara might like, stories about the farm that made her laugh. They courted properly the way they should have from the beginning, slowly, carefully, learning each other without the weight of survival pressing down on them. Margaret watched their courtship with something like wonder. "I've never seen two people work so hard to do things right," she said one evening as Clara prepared for Ethan's visit. "We got everything backward the first time," Clara said. "Marriage before love, desperation before trust. This time we're doing it in the proper order. And when the proper order feels right, you'll marry him again, yes. But this time it will mean something different." Clara looked at her reflection in the mirror. "This time it will be real." 2 years after Clara first arrived at Ethan Cole's farm, they married for the second time. The ceremony took place in the same church where they'd first spoken vows, but everything else was different. Clara wore a dress Margaret had helped her make, white silk with lace at the collar. Ethan wore a new suit and looked terrified and joyful in equal measure. Margaret served as Clara's witness, and Dr. Hartley stood for Ethan. Reverend Mills performed the ceremony with tears in his eyes, and when he pronounced them man and wife for the second time, Ethan kissed Clara in front of God and the small gathering of friends, and it felt like the beginning of something instead of the end. They built a life together, not perfect, but real. The farm prospered slowly, never becoming wealthy, but providing enough. Clara started a small school in town, teaching reading and writing to children whose parents couldn't afford formal education. Ethan helped when he could, his own reading improving, until he could manage the accounts and write letters without help. A year after their second wedding, Clara gave birth to a daughter. They named her Anna for Annabelle, and Clara held her newborn child and felt the circle close, life from death, hope from grief, a future built on the ruins of the past. Margaret married Dr. Hartley in a quiet ceremony finding late love with a good man who asked nothing of her except honesty. She remained Clara's closest friend, and the two women often sat together in the afternoons, their children playing at their feet, talking about nothing and everything. On the second anniversary of their second wedding, Clara and Ethan stood together on the hill overlooking Annabelle's grave. They'd had a proper stone placed there with her full name and dates and a line from the poetry book Clara had found in her room. Here lies Annabelle, who loved too much and too foolishly, but who taught her sister that courage means choosing to live even when living is hard. Ethan put his arm around Clara's waist, and she leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "Do you think she would have approved?" Clara asked. "Of us, I think she would have been happy someone found love from all that pain." Ethan kissed the top of Clara's head. "I think she would have loved Anna, would have spoiled her terribly." Anna was with Margaret today, giving Clara and Ethan rare time alone. They stood in the quiet cemetery as the sun set, casting long shadows across the grass. "I used to be angry at her," Clara admitted, "for dying, for leaving me, for not being strong enough to save herself from Samuel. But I'm not angry anymore. What changed, I learned that strength isn't always about surviving. Sometimes it's about making sure the people you love survive after you're gone." Annabelle's last letter to our mother, her warnings about Samuel, that was her trying to protect me. Even at the end, even when she was afraid, she was thinking about her little sister. She loved you, and I love her, always will. Clara turned from the grave to look at Ethan. "But I love you too, and I love our daughter. And I love the life we built from nothing. Is that wrong, to be happy when Annabelle never got the chance? It's not wrong, it's human, and I think it's what she would have wanted for you." Ethan took Clara's hand. "We honor her by living well, by loving well, by making sure her death meant something." They walked back down the hill as darkness gathered hand in hand. Behind them, Annabelle's stone stood silent in the gathering night, a marker of loss, but also of love, of a woman who died too young, but whose death had somehow led to life for those she'd left behind. At home, Anna was waiting, brought back by Margaret, who stayed for dinner. They sat around the table that Ethan had built with his own hands, eating food Clara had cooked, talking and laughing, while their daughter babbled in her high chair. It was ordinary and precious, this life they'd made. Nothing like what either of them had imagined when they first married in desperation and grief. But it was real, and it was theirs, and that made it beautiful. That night, after Margaret had gone home and Anna was asleep in her cradle, Clara and Ethan lay in their bed and listened to the wind move through the valley. The same wind that had blown the night Annabelle died. The same wind that had carried Clara to this farm 2 years ago, desperate and afraid and angry. "Tell me a secret," Clara said sleepily. "Something you've never told anyone." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I was afraid of you when you first arrived. Afraid of what you'd find, what you'd think of me. Afraid that you'd confirm everyone's worst suspicions. And now I'm afraid of losing you. Afraid that this happiness is too good to last. Afraid that I'll wake up one day and you'll be gone." Clara turned in his arms to face him. "I'm not going anywhere. This is my home. You're my home. Our daughter, our life, this is what I choose. Every day I choose this." She kissed him slow and deep, and felt his arms tighten around her. They made love, quietly mindful of their sleeping daughter in the next room, and afterward lay tangled together, breathing in sync. "I choose this too," Ethan whispered into her hair. "Every day, for the rest of my life." Clara felt sleep pulling at her, warm and safe, in a way she'd never been before. Her last conscious thought was gratitude, for the sister who'd loved her enough to leave warnings, for the man who'd kept his promises even when they cost him everything, for the friend who'd found courage at the moment it mattered most, for the daughter sleeping peacefully in the next room, proof that even the darkest beginnings could lead to light. The poorest man had bought a bride he didn't want with money he didn't have, and that bride had come seeking justice for a dead sister and found instead a life worth living. They'd both been broken by circumstances beyond their control, both been used by cruel men, both been left with nothing but each other and the choice to survive together or die alone. They'd chosen survival, and from that choice had grown something neither of them had dared hope for. Not just survival, but joy. Not just existence, but life. full and messy and real and theirs. Outside the wind settled, the valley grew quiet, and in a farmhouse that had once been a place of grief, a family slept peacefully, wrapped in love, earned through trial and pain, and the simple courage to keep choosing each other day after day after day. Annabel's grave on the hill stood silent under the stars. But if the dead could speak, if they could send blessings across the divide between what was and what is, perhaps her voice would have whispered through the darkness, "Live well, little sister, love well, and know that I am proud of the woman you became." The night held no answer. But in the morning, when Clara woke to find Ethan already up making coffee, while Anna babbled in her cradle, when she saw the life they'd built shining golden in the early light, she thought maybe her sister's spirit had found peace at last, and so had she.